Hello, and welcome to Baltic Ways, a podcast bringing you interviews and insights from the world of Baltic studies. I'm your guest host, Ben Gardner-Gill, filling in for Dr. Indra Egmanis. Today we are joined by Dr. Agnia Grigas, an author, speaker, and consultant on energy and political risk. She is the author of 3 critically acclaimed books: The New Geopolitics of Gas, Beyond Crimea, the New Russian Empire, and The Politics of Energy and Memory Between the Baltic States and Russia. She holds a doctorate in international relations from the University of Oxford, where she's an alumna of St. Antony's and Brasenose colleges, and a BA cum laude in economics and political science from Columbia University in New York. Dr. Grigas, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Baltic Ways.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
So let's jump right in. 2 days before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, you were on a panel with the thesis that, and I quote, "Europe's lack of a sustainable and independent energy framework not only poses significant economic challenges, but also security risks for the region." We've now seen this bear out over the last year. So to start, could you walk us back a bit? How did we get to this point prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
So prior to the invasion first of all, the second invasion, right? In February, but we've been in this situation for decades. I mean, that's the reality. And prior to the second invasion, I also recall being on some other panel with, experts from Ukraine. And I was wondering, how many people really care about European energy security, right? I mean, even though we are well aware that this is a painful area, painful topic, but that interest would always wane. If you go back, I mean, honestly, as far back as the Reagan era, this is the time when the United States first started getting concerned about Europe's developing dependence on Russian fossil fuels. And Reagan at the time actually tried to stop the pipelines that were being built from the Soviet Union at the time into Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe. But the United States, of course, at the time also didn't have alternatives it could offer. So the pipelines went through, and we've seen since the Cold War era, Europe become incredibly dependent on Russia. I mean, really, it was in 2021, Europe was about 40% dependent on Russian gas, also a large consumer of Russian oil. And frankly, the sales of these resources have essentially been the reasons why the Kremlin and the Russian Federation has stayed afloat, right? These have been the reasons why it has managed also to develop and fund its military and launch these military campaigns from the ones in Georgia to the occupation of Crimea in 2014, and now to the second invasion of Ukraine.
Absolutely. I mean, the funding has been a very large aspect of Russia's foreign policy, just in general. So the U.S. first tried to get the pipelines not built, and now the pipelines are there, but the alternatives are now in a much better place than they were during Ronald Reagan's era. So there's been discussion and some advocacy for a Green Deal for Ukraine as part of the reconstruction that Europe will provide. And more broadly, in the moment, there has been a lot of, shall we say, consternation about how Europe will handle its energy needs during the war. So that's a 2-part question. We'll start with the present and the past many months, past year since the second invasion. How do you assess that Europe has handled the energy crisis side of this geopolitical development?
So, on the positive note, since the previous energy crisis Europe had already faced with Russia in the 2000s and 2009, the various energy cuts Russia had enacted on Ukraine had already started, the wheels turning in Brussels. And Brussels had enacted a lot of reforms, changes, built up of interconnecting infrastructure between the different European states, so pipeline interconnectors, expanding storage capacity, requiring greater storage, greater storage for security purposes from different states. So a lot of work had been done, and some European states, and I can tell you those that in fact were the most vulnerable and that had already experienced Russia's strong arm tactics and Russia's energy weapons, they had also done their homework. So what I'm talking about specifically, of course, Lithuania had built its LNG import terminal, a small-scale floating terminal. Countries like Poland, they have built a large import terminal. Finland, likewise, a number of LNG projects completed and in the works. So a number of countries did do their homework, and when this crisis hit, they were essentially prepared. They were prepared to not import any Russian fossil fuels if needed, and countries like Lithuania, like Poland, they were among the first to do so, that they will not consume any or import Russian oil or gas. Now, other countries, a lot of them that had in fact been less vulnerable, countries in Western Europe, I'm speaking specifically about Germany. Germany was very complacent. Their essential policy when it came to their energy was, well, before we complete our energy revolution and go green, we're just going to rely more on Russian gas. We're going to become a Russian gas hub here in Europe and have cheap, plentiful gas. So clearly that strategy did not work out for them. They met this crisis very unprepared. Overall, we've seen, of course, prices increase all across Europe. So despite the fact that countries were able to do without Russian gas, let's say, it doesn't mean that the impact wasn't felt in terms of pricing, in terms of potential shortages, in terms of some rationing, and so on.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of those intra-European, especially intra-EU dynamics between these countries. As you put it, several countries did their homework. They were prepared. They were the first to come out in front and say, we're cutting off Russian supplies. And others, to name a name, Germany, are not. The Baltic countries, Lithuania, but also Estonia and Latvia, have come to the forefront in many sectors and many areas of European Union and broader, just general European debate during the war. Energy is certainly one of them. Could you dive into that a bit more and talk about how the energy leadership shown by the Baltics and also by Poland and Finland, I think, as similarly minded neighbors, has impacted broader relationships and the working environment with those countries and their compatriots in the EU?
So because countries in the Baltic states, first of all, they had experienced Russia's energy cutoffs in the past. Back in the 90s, when they had declared their independence, they had faced a full Russian embargo on oil, on gas, and so on. So they had that experience. They had also had the experience of being essentially, nearly 100% dependent on Russian gas. And Gazprom had a monopoly in the Baltic states for many years, until really it became almost unbearable to maintain the situation, because Gazprom would demand higher and higher prices. I mean, the Baltic states were paying higher gas prices than many countries in Western Europe, further geographically away from Russia, and also because Russia would use gas contract negotiations at the time to try to exert political pressure. So, of course, we see a lot of the motivation of why they took the steps, why they started the LNG import terminal, why they built up interconnectors between the Baltic states and interconnectors to Poland and Finland. But they were also the countries that, when the war started, they were willing to be, those voices of moral conscience for the European Union. They were the first to say, while a lot of Western European countries and some experts would say, oh, it's impossible for Europe to do without Russian gas. It's impossible for Europe not to buy Russian oil. And here are these small, you can say, countries that somewhat less affluent than some of their neighbors said, you know what, we can. Actually, starting tomorrow, we're not going to buy any Russian gas. We're not going to buy any Russian oil. And we are countries that have, until recently, have been 100% dependent on Russian gas. So I think the message that sent, look, if we can do it, How can you tell me that, you can't? And to me, this is, kind of the big question. If we look at, I guess we can compare now Germany and Poland. So if Poland was able to build an LNG import terminal, move away from near 100% dependence and having a near Gazprom monopoly in its country priorly, why Germany, the largest gas importer in all of Europe, also Gazprom's #1 client, a country like that, why hadn't it thought about diversifying, having LNG import terminals or other ideas, right? So I think that raised great questions, and Brussels and other European countries had to have some answers, not just fall back to, well, we can't do without Russian oil and gas. We just can't do it.
Right.
That wasn't good enough anymore.
Right, exactly. And there's, I would venture to say, been movement from some of those more reticent countries since the second invasion, but certainly not as fast. So that does lead me into where we're headed in the near future, not so much thinking about the long-term fight against climate change, but for as long as Russian occupation continues in Ukraine, there will still be a challenge with these countries who have not yet weaned themselves off of Russian imports, and who are still dependent on fossil fuels more generally. How long do you think Europe, excepting Ukraine, can weather this situation? And where do you think they should go, both geographically, potentially, but also in terms of philosophically about their energy supplies to not only survive this war, but build out of it?
So first, I will say this winter has been a real great test case for Europe. To what extent they can weather a winter, without Russian gas or with, reduced supplies of Russian gas. Because really it's, again, in Europe, this gas demand is very seasonal, and the winter season is also politically very sensitive. I mean, a lot of households in Europe depend on gas for heating in the winter months. Industry, of course, depends on it as well. So the fact that the continent was able to weather well and will be able to weather this winter will prove that test case that this is possible. Now, what comes next? Well, next comes, okay, how can we do it better, more efficiently, at lower prices? And what is our long-term goal overall? So in terms of where are these alternatives coming? Well, it's LNG today. The LNG market, the liquefied natural gas market, has been growing really exponentially since America's shale revolution. And the demand for LNG across the world has been growing significantly, and in Europe. So we will continue to see that growing. Not all the countries, as we discussed, had the infrastructure to receive it, but a lot of European countries do, and they're in now more and more interconnecting infrastructure across the European continent, from the have-nots, the countries maybe that don't have a coastline or don't have the infrastructure, to the ones that do. Where are some of these key sources? So some of them are traditional. I mean, Norway. Norway is one of the countries that has been a significant supplier of Europe, and a country that's now expanding its LNG exports as well. Qatar, another country that traditionally supplied the European markets. Some other North African countries, but of course the big game changer here has been the United States. So since America's shale revolution, since the United States essentially became an energy superpower, the largest producer of oil and natural gas in the world, that really created a new significant supplier. And American LNG has been successfully making its way to Europe even before the invasion. And now, of course, since the invasion, it has emerged as one of the leading LNG suppliers in the European Union. Again, this is very interesting because there were a lot of naysayers. So when I was writing my book, The New Geopolitics of Natural Gas, that came out in 2019, I'm thinking I'd have to recall that. So at the time, there were a lot of naysayers saying, well, American LNG will never be competitive in Europe. It's too expensive. It's going to be too far away. Maybe American LNG will only go to the Asian markets. But we've seen all of that discredited. Because why? Another reason to consider is, people think, oh, Russian gas is cheap. Now let's think about that. Can a resource from a country that's, I don't even know how to describe its system currently. What would be the proper words to describe it? Authoritarian regime with resources owned by the state and managed by a small clique of individuals. And is that an efficient industry? And questions whether the Russian energy industry is efficient and whether it can even sustain itself, have been around for quite some time with exports. So I think that's another reason why we see American gas so competitive, being so price competitive in Europe. The fact is that the Russian energy industry is not that efficient and it's not that price competitive. It functions on the basis of striking political deals in Europe, those, doing these sweeteners for these gas deals on the back of political relationships. I think that's how Russia has gained the significant market share in Europe, not on the basis of its efficient energy market or industry.
Absolutely. And, you talk there about quote unquote political deals. And you also mentioned Qatar, which of course is in the news in the European community at the moment as well for similar quote unquote political deals alleged. So I won't go down that path immediately, but I am curious because you do bring up the United States and its role with LNG in supplying the European market. If you could talk a little bit more about the effects of this new energy relationship on the transatlantic relationship, and then as well, as both countries continue down more green paths to renewables, how this new strengthened relationship will be affected by both sides making those transitions.
So America's emergence as an energy superpower has had a significant impact on geopolitics overall, and of course on the transatlantic relationship. And if we go back now to the Reagan era, as I hinted at the beginning, so at the time, while the United States was the main security guarantor for European countries, NATO countries, it didn't have its resources, right? So it couldn't offer alternatives for the European Union states, and therefore Europe at the time had become, and it grew its dependence on Russian oil and gas. Today, as NATO's again leading security power, it can support its allies, not just let's say as a security guarantor militarily, but also through energy resources. And this is very significant because, in fact, if we look at the NATO members and the NATO alliance and the transatlantic relationship, America's partners tend to be energy importing states, right? Most of the European countries, they are energy importers. These are energy poor countries. Countries like South Korea and Japan are likewise energy importing countries. So the fact that the United States today can offer them resources is a big game changer and very significant. I mean, it means that members of the alliance don't have to be essentially dependent on countries that they perceive to be hostile, as in the case of Russia. So that has been a major significant change. Of course, if we're looking into the future, both Europe and the United States see their future in renewables. That's something that has been very much emphasized by the Biden administration when he came to office. And it's something, of course, that has been in the plans and in the works for European countries. But until that renewable future comes, having access to those secure fossil fuels from your ally countries versus potentially hostile countries is a big game changer.
So we've just talked about the strengthened transatlantic relationship as a whole. Let's focus in on the Baltic states a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously very strong relationships with the United States. I'm really curious to know more about how they're approaching the green transition, given that, as you said, many European countries, and those three included, are energy poor to some extent. They all do have some renewable options, but I want to hear your thoughts on that. Where are they headed into a green future?
So, the Baltic states, having been essentially largely energy poor countries in the past, have also always treated this very seriously, their energy security and potential solutions for their situation. Estonia in a unique way had shale oil, and that was something that they've had to phase out due to EU regulations. So they're also looking for alternatives. If we look at Latvia has a history of hydropower, but again, not enough to meet all of its needs. Lithuania used to have a nuclear power plant, which again, it had to close down due to EU regulation when it joined the European Union. There were discussions among the three states to maybe build a nuclear power plant, and that never came to fruition. I think that right now, also during this energy crisis, there has been some questions. Maybe that should have, been achieved. In fact, there's a lot of innovation when it comes to hydrofuels, various uses of natural gas in the transportation sector, in industry. So in fact, we're seeing these three countries, I would say, on the kind of the very leading edges of innovation in terms of adopting new fuel usages and efficiency methods. Even solar, wind, again, biofuel, biomass, all of that is within the Baltic industries.
Absolutely. So they're obviously heading in a more positive direction in some regards, which is encouraging to see from the global perspective of where our entire world is headed. Let's bring it now back out to Europe as a whole, the Baltics place within Europe. Do you see, and you sort of led into this, the Baltics being still on the leading edge of the energy transition, 5-10 years down the road? As you've also said, they assumed this position of sort of a moral conscience of the continent to some extent since the second invasion of Ukraine. Will they maintain that position with regards to energy?
Well, I would also say it was out of necessity, now not solely out of their moral position as well. So this, these are small energy vulnerable countries. The cost of energy is quite high within the overall standard of living and industry. So it's a type of pain, the kind of the pain of energy access and energy prices is something that an average household feels there very acutely. An average business owner, small business owner, and the manufacturing and industry in that region. So I think they will continue to be on the leading edge when it comes to looking for solutions, not only to ensure energy supply and their energy security, but also to make it cost effective, efficient and cost effective.
Yeah, I hear that. Moving to our last question here. So as a scholar of energy policy, of energy and political risk, you have your mind on a lot of different things at the same time. What can people who maybe have their minds in other areas, who maybe are studying different things, either professionally or just have a deep interest elsewhere, what can they learn from the study of energy policy and its interaction with politics? What unique lessons are brought to all of us?
Well, I think the first element to remember is that energy impacts everyone. It's it impacts society, it impacts our economies, it impacts industry, it impacts even what's possible in terms of innovation in our industry. So it's a very all-encompassing field. And for me, I've always been very interested in the geopolitical element of it as well. Part of this is, of course, in relation to who in the past have been the key suppliers, right, of fossil fuels. And these have generally, you can say, have been authoritarian states. And today, if I'm thinking, sharing some of my broader thoughts, today I believe we truly are in a geopolitical contest between democratic and authoritarian states. And in this global geopolitical contest, it's very important that we as democratic societies remain secure in a variety of ways, right? That our societies are secure, we're secure from information warfare, that we have access to the energy resources that we need from trustworthy suppliers, again, not the suppliers who are going to try to exert political influence on us, also that we can do business in this energy sector transparently, right? Without maybe the kind of political nuances behind it, or trying to use, or use of the energy weapon, or use of influence, or various corruption schemes. So, in that regard, the energy sector is where you see it all. All of these factors come head to head. The geopolitical contest between Russia, China, the United States, the European Union, the security of our alliances, the security of our states. And this war in particular, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has even, put all of this under a magnifying glass for the whole world to see, in fact, how an invasion of by an authoritarian country of another country, a country that is also, Ukraine is a key transit state for energy resources from Russia to Western Europe. How can that upset the whole global economy and the global energy markets? So I think, citizens have felt this across the world.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful place to end. It's both a optimistic message, and it's also grounded in where we are right now. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Agnia Grigas. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.